I think I'm constantly painting about death and dying to remember that that's going to happen to me. That I'm constantly reminding myself that my life isn't going to last forever. I put the word death in my studio in big black letters to remind myself that I'm going to die. For me, it's just what keeps me living and doing what I want to do while I'm alive. You're only here for a short while, so make sure you are living the best you possibly can. I got into art at a young age. I think I've always been obsessed with it. Coloring books and crayons and just paper and pencil were always around. They were cheap and easy to just give me, and I gravitated towards it. It allowed me to express myself, and it was just fun for me. I just never stopped. And then in the 80s was the big boom of skateboarding and that culture. Steve Caballero and Tony Hawk, and buying issues of Thrasher magazine and just like flipping through that and just seeing all the skateboard graphics. And, you know, it was like cartoons for me, and each one was so unique. I'm going to sit in here and figure out how to draw this skull with this dagger going through it, you know. Yeah, I was obsessed with all of that stuff. After college, I realized that a fine arts degree isn't going to get you much as far as a job. And then at that time, I ended up working at the Pittsburgh International Airport. The first day of full-time training, there was a television on. We're all watching it, and it's planes flying into buildings. And that happened to be September 11th, 2001. I knew right then and there that this isn't going to be a full-time job, you know. And then they let me go. They let everybody go. That was it. I decided to get into embalming and funeral directing after being laid off from the airlines. In my brain, it was, I want a job where I don't have to worry about being laid off again. And, you know, the idea of like death and dying just fascinated me. There was a time me and another funeral director walked into a home to do this removal. And by removal, I mean we'd go pick up the body. And he had basically said, like, I was just told that he's here. He lived by himself, but he was a shut-in. So basically when we were walking into the house, we had to step up another 2 to 3 feet on top of like newspapers and garbage. And it was just like, he's in here somewhere. It can weigh on you like mentally. You know, you walk into tragic situations, you know, in people's homes, but you got to do your job, you know. It's just weird sometimes. For me, one of the hardest parts of the job was actually like feeling like I had a life outside of the funeral home. Because I was on call so much, I always felt like my phone was like just ready to go off. But in a way, being on call and feeling like I am locked in my apartment waiting for the phone to ring, I think that time is what made me a better artist, because that's what made me put in the time and the practice of like the repetitive painting. You know, I went from making these kind of crude paintings to making these like very clean versions of the woodcut prints that I was making back in college. It just kind of clicked, and that's kind of what I do today. Being surrounded by death made me rethink my career choice. You're losing time all the time, and you're seeing these people come into the funeral home, Some of them are in their 20s or their 30s. You don't know like how much time you have. So if you're going to do this art thing, it's like you better start figuring it out now. I feel like everything in my life's taken a little longer than I expected it to. I don't know, like for some reason in my head, I was thinking like, well, by 25, you're married and you're like starting to have kids. And I was like, well, I'm not married now and I don't have any kids. So, things just take a little longer for some of us. And I feel like that's the same for my art career. It just took me a while to like figure it out. So 2006, I became obsessed with the author Chuck Palahniuk, who famously wrote Fight Club. He was accepting fan letters. So I wrote him a letter and I said, I'm a funeral director and embalmer, but my main goal is to be an artist. And then like a month later, a box arrived and he's like, gosh, a funeral director turned fine artist is like a PR's dream story. One day I hope that you're painting so much the bodies are stacking up and you can't get to them because you got to make your paintings. It was just like such a sweet letter and I still have it to this day. Geez, I worked like full-time jobs and then I do like 6 solo shows in a year. It was like insane. But as an artist, I had to prove myself. And then finally I could take that leap. I was all in. When I'm making a painting, sometimes I have like ideas in my head, but for the most part, I'm drawing directly onto like a board or a canvas. And then once all the colors are in, then it's like smaller brushes that I'm using to like do all the fine lines. That's kind of like pulling all of these colors together. It's about getting something out of you. It could be happiness, could be sadness, could be anger. Once I'm happy with like how this painting looks, then I will water down paint and then I kind of like splash it across the surface. I just have this idea in my head that like nothing can ever be perfect. And then I'll take sandpaper and I'll like kind of go over the surface and I'll pull up the baby blues of the skulls that were underneath. They become like these like ghostly images like on top of the other painting that you finished. I make 50 paintings every year called Tiny Deaths, and the reason I started making them was I felt like we all have these tiny deaths in our lives. Obviously, there's the big death where you're gonna stop living, but you and a friend stop talking, or it could be auto accidents. They're like these little potholes in our lives that change our lives. I want to pay tribute to these things that happen to us, and they become little funeral markers to these experiences that we all have. I mean, I've certainly had my fair share of tiny deaths in my life. I don't feel like I would be where I am right now if those things didn't happen to me. So I feel like they're almost in a way meant to happen to us, and they are tools for us to learn how to be a better person or to move on and grow as a human being. I think my paintings are brighter now because I'm probably in a better spot now, emotionally and mentally, than I was in the past. I was going through a lot of different things. When you're a struggling artist, things aren't always like fun. You're going to see probably a lot more like navy blues and blacks and grays. And now that I know what I'm doing now, I'm okay. I finally gotten to that point where I can tell my mom like I'm okay, but I think more importantly, like I'm telling myself like I'm okay. I think people are drawn to my artwork because they see themselves in it in some way, whether it's like a story that they have that just happens to be, tied into like a painting that I made. Overall, as a society, we're very obsessed with the idea of like death and dying and what happens afterwards. And, with colors like that I use that are like bright and colorful. It's very welcoming. There's like a sense of happiness to my work. Being somebody that is more introverted and doesn't necessarily talk a lot, I can actually like paint you a picture and say like, this is what I'm trying to say to you. It's like a form of therapy, meditation, exercise, and everything all rolled into one. This is like my number one joy, to like make these paintings. I feel like it's also kind of given me a purpose in my life. I've like kind of found that reason to keep living.